Yes. Good morning, everybody. My name is Kara Feldman-Hunt. I'm the director of the Osher Center for Integrative Health, and I have the honor of introducing our speaker this morning. First and foremost, this is Family Medicine Grand Rounds, and I just wanted to thank the Department of Family Medicine for partnering with us for so many years on this lecture series, and this is part of the Laura Mann Integrative Healthcare Lecture Series, where we have an endowment to bring in 3 to 4 speakers a year who are leaders in the field of integrative health and medicine. And it is really such an honor to be able to introduce Dr. Sarah Jaquette Ray today. Sarah is a professor and chair of the Environmental Studies Department at Cal Poly Humboldt, working at the intersection of social justice and climate emotions. She's the author of a field guide to climate anxiety, how to keep your cool on a warming planet or a cold planet like this morning, she's the lead editor of the Existential Toolkit for Climate Justice Educators, a certified mindfulness teacher through UCLA's Mindfulness Awareness Research Center. Dr. Ray serves on the Scientific Advisory Board for the Climate Mental Health Network and speaks widely on the role of emotions in climate advocacy. So we're thrilled to have Dr. Ray with us. I also wanted to let people know that this afternoon at 2 o'clock, Dr. Ray will be doing a book talk on both of her books. We're going to have a discussion, book signing if you're interested. We'll have snacks. Everybody is welcome. It's at the Osher Center at 184 South Prospect at 2 o'clock. And so we welcome you all to come. And I will turn it over to Dr. Ray. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kara. Can you hear me okay? This is I did turn it on. Maybe I need a little bit closer. I will put it right there at the top of my. Ooh, it's hitting my face. How's that? Is that okay? Is that working? Not quite, not great. Is there an in between? Maybe if it just hangs there. How about if it just hangs there?
I think that works.
If I don't move too much. Okay. Someone give me like a cue if it gets a little funky or goes down my sweater here. Okay. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Kara, for all the coordination to get me here and all the folks who contributed to getting me here. The Osher Center in particular. I did the 3-flight jump thing yesterday from California, so that was fun. But I'm really excited to see all the snow. This is not part of my world, so that's really fun to look out my window this morning and see all that snow. So I'm excited to be in a very different climate than what I'm used to, and from the redwoods in Northern California. So I wanted to start us off with a slide that's got a comic that I really like. I'll give you a minute to take that in and give you a little bit of a background for why it is that I turned my attention towards this particular research topic. So in the past, my background is actually in religious studies, and then I did an American Studies MA, and then I have a PhD in environmental sciences studies and policy. So super interdisciplinary. I've been sort of in this like interdisciplinary, on the margins of academia, trying to combine things from lots of different places for a long time. But I had mostly come to focus on in a world that was sort of understood as the environmental humanities with an environmental justice emphasis. So I was trying to figure out how to get environmental studies to do more justice-oriented work. And a lot of that stuff was coming actually out of the humanities and social sciences. Then around 2014, 2015, right before the 2016 US presidential election, I was noticing that my students were like all of a sudden really not doing okay. And there was this larger background noise about the youth mental health crisis that was happening around the country. And so that was research I was doing on the side, like, what's going on with my students? Why are they not okay? They're not coming to class. They don't seem well. They're coming in with a lot more kind of crisis-oriented stuff, not just to do with like kind of the material crisis, like food security and stuff like that, but like mental health stuff going on more so than I had in my career at that point. And at some point, several breakdowns happened over the course of the semester, this one particular semester. And I realized that my students were not like emotionally equipped to deal with the content that they were learning in the classrooms, and that environmental education in general, especially around climate change, they were coming in with more and more doom and gloom about how bad things were around climate change. They were getting it mostly, it turns out, I did research later, they were getting it mostly from social media, and that's still true today, that students get most of their climate change information education through social media, not through high school education, not through parents, but through that medium, which is itself something I'll bracket and come back to in a minute. But they were coming in already not really well. And at that point, most of environmental education and climate education was really in this model of what I called the scare to care pedagogy, which is like, if we just get students more like scared enough about how bad things are, we can just assume that they will then go off and do the things they need to do. And this is sort of what sociologists are now calling the information deficit model, or the information deficit myth, which is that if we just give people more information about how bad things are, we can assume that the appropriate action will follow. And it turns out that the story behind how you get people to change behavior and how you get people to care about something is much more emotional. And so this is something that's probably something you're all attuned to, that getting people to do things with their bodies or health or their minds or the planet is not necessarily a logical thing, right? It's not about reason and like giving them good arguments for doing it. It usually is very, very emotional. People make decisions and change their behavior for emotional reasons. And so I started to do this research about, what do my students need emotionally to get to class? What do they need emotionally to go out and when they graduate, do the kinds of work that we want them to do in the world, right? Go save the planet, for goodness sake, right? Go save all these problems we're scaring them about. Of course, I learned later that's pretty rude to do that with students. And so now I have stepped way back from the brink on that one. And I have this also insight about, the stuff that we're teaching in the classes, in stuff like maybe Native American studies or maybe history. There are subjects where with the stuff that you're teaching in the classes is really upsetting for students. And those pedagogies around that oftentimes account for how upset students are going to be with the content. But in environmental and climate education, that has rarely been the case. There hasn't been a real awareness or acknowledgement that students come into the classroom as whole people, not just heads that are out there to solve heady problems, but actually as whole people with hearts and minds. And this real aversion to acknowledging that climate education could be very upsetting to students and young people. And so there's a growing awareness that I feel like has been really fun to be part of, to bring the whole student into the conversations around climate education. And this reason why I love this comic or this graphic here is because it illustrates the kind of crazy folly of trying to think that we are going to, in classrooms, much less in therapy rooms, adjust people to be happy about the state of the world and things that we're teaching them in the class, that things that are happening outside of classes or outside of therapy rooms are in fact coming into our classrooms and into our therapy rooms. And then also that classes at all, or even therapy at all, could help students in this particular way without actually addressing these structural problems that are causing the problems going on in the outside world, right? So there's this kind of lot of things happening in this comic that I like to open up with and give you a little background as to why I studied this. I don't just talk with students. I often talk with groups like this, or churches, or synagogues, or all kinds of places where I go. This particular topic of climate anxiety turns out to be kind of not specific to any particular age, although young people in general have more higher incidence of climate anxiety and climate emotions, more intense feelings of dread about the future than older people, for reasons that have to do with the obvious. And so the first book that I wrote, A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety, was really geared towards young people. And then the book that I wrote about teaching was really geared for people who are in the classrooms with young people trying to figure that out. But I would say A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety absolutely kind of transcends different ages. It's not just for folks who are young. I just happen to write it for young people because those were my peeps in my classroom. So that was what got me thinking about it. All right, let's open up with a little bit of a temperature check for you all. This is a beautiful graphic. Amy Saels in the room right here is part of this book, Existential Toolkit. This is one of the reasons I'm excited to be here in Vermont, because I get to connect with one of the contributors to this amazing book. It was an edited collection with about 30 different people who contributed. One of the contributors was somebody named M. Wright, and they made this beautiful graphic that I absolutely love, that if you can see it, is that Wendy coming in? Hi, Wendy. Hey, in person. Yay. This is a beautiful graphic about climate stress responses. And what I love about it is it takes on if you look on the outside circle, there's this light gray band on the outside circle that has this category of beliefs, and they're in, all the beliefs are in quote marks. So if you can read some of these, can you actually see this in the back? Yeah, you can read these. Okay. So take a minute to go around that circle on the outside and pick one or two beliefs that feel like they may be sort of close to where you feel maybe in the last day or two. And when you've found one that might be akin to where you're at, or even remotely, maybe shout it out. Yeah.
Not sure what will make the biggest impact.
Yeah. Yeah, this kind of confusion and uncertainty, and which way do I put my energy? I don't want to waste my energy on this particular thing if that's not going to make a big impact. Somebody just give me the data that shows that if I put my life's energy in this direction, it'll have the greatest impact. Yeah, absolutely. Right. I want a silver bullet solution. Let's just all get on board and figure that out and do it. Totally. I have that every day. Any others? Yeah. Yeah, it's really similar, right? Yeah. That turns out to be a significant percentage of Americans. There's something like 75% of Americans are worried or extremely worried about climate change, according to the Yale Center for Climate Communication. And only about 25% of those people actually do anything or claim in the surveys that they do anything about climate change. So this kind of question about like, oh, so do I need to do something different? Am I okay?
No, just when they're.
Oh yeah, thank you, Angie, thank you. Coming around with the microphone. Okay. This big swath of people who care a lot but don't know what to do, right, is actually the majority of people who care a lot. It was, in fact, that majority of people in that exact boat that motivated me to think about, okay, that's something we can do. That's not about convincing the deniers that they have to care. That's already about figuring out how to work with the coalition of the willing and interested around what they care about. And I think that's one of the real misconceptions, is that most of us have to go out and try to convince people who are on the other side to care about climate change. But in fact, if 75% of Americans already care about climate change, that really isn't a necessary activity for necessarily all of us to do. So anybody else want to add anything in here?
I feel guilty for indulging in pleasures that I know are part of the problem.
Yeah, like flying to Vermont. Yeah, thank you.
I was gonna say I fluctuate between that one and the I take action to honor my boundaries so I don't burn out. So it's like this, like
titrating back and
Yeah.
forth. Yeah, right. Like I understand the guilt, and then I go over here with boundaries. Yeah, thank you, Angie. Sorry. Yes, absolutely. And because I'm in California, this one always comes up when I'm in anywhere in the West. I'm anxious about the next wildfire season, right? Or you might be anxious about what's happening with snow, right? We were talking, Kara and I, this morning, and in the car about the snow, right? And then, so this is what I love about this graphic, and I want to point out this graphic to you too, is that some of you in this room, let's just take a kind of a measure of hands. How many of this room, I'm guessing quite a few, are familiar with things like the nervous system and dysregulation and the window of tolerance and that kind of thing? Yeah, this is a group who gets that stuff, right? So sometimes I feel like I need to really go unpack a lot of that stuff for in more environmental crowds, but this is a health crowd, so that's stuff that you all are familiar with. What I love about this is that it brings out how those beliefs are attached to nervous system responses to threats, right? So when we get a threat into our our sense doors or into our nervous system, into our risk perception window, it can trigger us into any number of one of these directions depending on the causes and conditions of our lives, right? And there's a lot of background to that. I'm not going to go into that in detail, but depending on who you are, you might actually respond in a way that's very fight, flight, freeze, fawn perspective, or as someone just mentioned here, more towards the social engagement, which of course we can see how something like fight has people responding to climate anxiety in ways that we've seen maybe in El Paso or Christchurch and in Buffalo, right? Mass shootings, right? Or we can see something like in the flight category, people just like going right into their phones, right? So I particularly like this comic for the flight category, right? This is how I feel often, right? So this comic has this older person, presumably talking to this younger person. Maybe it's like a grandpa with a grandkid at the beach. I imagine this grandpa's like, I'm going to get my grandkid out to experience nature and get them off their phone, right? Kind of a trope, right? And taking the kid out to the beach. Oh, listen to this beautiful ocean and the shell. You think I'm going to introduce this kid to all the wonders and senses of being out in nature, right? We want this this is what nature therapy is about. A lot of people do a lot of this work around ecotherapy, but the kid is like, no, it's not working for me, right? Right? The kind of like assumption that if we just get people out in nature more, they're somehow going to have calm nervous systems and be okay. It's not totally wrong, but some of us might actually have some anxieties we encounter when we experience nature that way, right? This sense of sort of doom and gloom around oh, actually when I'm with nature, I see its demise, right? I can see its inherent, being threatened or being ruined. And for me, that goes to a flight response mostly. I'm into dissociation. I love this kid. Is like, I just want my iPod back. I want to dissociate. And so it's a little bit, this comic could be taken as like a critique of this young kid, right? And how sad it is that young kids nowadays just want to go into their screens, right? This is a common trope. We hear it all the time. But I actually think I'm much more compassionate to this kid. The cognitively elegant solution to how bad things are in yourself and your students, in your clients and your patients, whoever it is you're talking about, right? The cognitive solution to that is to just to avoid it. If you are presented with a problem like climate change that feels so big and so untouchable and so impossible to affect yourself, right? Like I don't even know what action is going to do any effect. What would you do, right? That sense of crisis of agency usually causes somebody to go into one of those categories, and dissociation to me is the sort of the lowest hanging fruit one, easiest, right? Let's just go back to my normal life and forget about it. So I'm a little more compassionate for this poor kid. They remind me of me. Okay, so this is the thing that I would like to start off with, the first claim. Emotions shape our climate anxiety. Okay, our climate capacity, excuse me. So our climate capacity is very much shaped by our emotions. And this is something that my students really taught me in the very beginning when I was like, oh, they're not doing well in my classes, right? They're freaking out. The world isn't going well. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because a lot of people want to sidestep the role of emotion in getting these problems solved. They feel like the emotions just get in the way of effective action, or they think that emotions are going to bias us about effective actions. All kinds of reasons why emotions get kind of a bad rep in thinking about climate action. And I'm trying to resuscitate it and make a case for we should maybe think more seriously about the role of emotions in being able to help us deal with climate change. Here are the reasons why. First reason is that emotions dictates decision-making, the ability to build community, the ability to figure out what a responsible action could be in response to something like a climate threat, and the ability to engage in meaningful work despite setbacks. I think a lot of what gets people to want to go back to their iPod, which is funny that kid wanted to go to their iPod. That's dates that comic a lot. Now an iPod's like analog and cool, and actually a little bit more close to nature. To my students, they're like, let's get back to nature, go to your iPods, let's get music off streaming, right? Anyway, sorry, but let's call it an iPod for now. Right, this idea that we can engage in meaningful work despite setbacks seems to be a big one. Many of my students and people that I work with want to see the results of their actions, right? Like, it is worth it if I can see, like, this sacrifice or this hard work or this blood, sweat, and tears I'm offering to this movement is only really worth it if I can see the results of the actions. And so this kind of emotional intelligence that requires to figure out how we're going to do this work, even if we don't see the impacts of them. The science of emotions shows that different emotions shape climate action in different ways. And I think we should try to be more strategic about this, not because we should manipulate people. I'm not into like behavior change theory on that level, right? I'm not into engineering people's behavior. But for example, just in a classroom, if we're not thoughtful about the hidden emotional curriculum of what we're teaching our students about this kind of implicit scare to care curriculum, we might have our students not showing up in class. We might have our students doing all kinds of other things that we wouldn't want them to do. We might be contributing to their mental health problems in ways that original comic showed in the therapy room, right? And so, for example, also, if we think about an emotion like guilt, right? Like, many of my students come out of high school into college having taken something called the ecological footprint activity. Has anybody ever taken that? Only 3 or 4 of you. Wow. Yeah. Okay. So not many folks. This is what happens when you go to a health place, not an environment place, right? If you're in the environment space, many people have taken this test. This is a test. You can get it online. You can check it out right now if you want to. It's called the ecological footprint activity. And it's basically an activity where you can do a survey, take 15 minutes to do a survey about your consumption patterns. And then by the end, it does a calculation and tells you how many Earths you would need to supply your consumption patterns of your life. What's your carbon impact on the planet, and how many planets it would need for every person to consume the way you consume. So it's the resulting emotion of that particular activity is what? Thank you, right? Yeah, most people finish that activity and feel kind of terrible about themselves, right? Like pervasively complicit in the destruction of the earth. All of a sudden they see their daily activities that they wanted to just get on with, or, I just want my iPod back kind of stuff, right? That actually has these big knock-on effects on the planet and this incredible sense of guilt. So people who study this psychology of environmental behavior have studied how long that guilt lasts to affect behavior change in those people. How long do you think it lasts?
2 minutes.
2 minutes for you. You're like, guilt doesn't work on me.
Well, it shuts you down.
On average, right? It shuts you down, right? Most people, what happens with guilt is they just want to get away from the uncomfortable feeling, right? That's an aversive feeling. I want to get away from it. This is sort of the kind of Buddhist approach, right? Like that feeling doesn't feel good. I'm going to go over here where it feels good, right? It doesn't actually necessarily result in the kinds of actions that would change the causes of that guilt in the first place. Most people just want to not feel guilty anymore. So on average, it's about 6 weeks of behavior change. What emotions do you think you need to feel personally to do a behavior change for like your life? Hope? Great. Yeah. Yeah, the ecological footprint activity, no surprise here, was actually created by BP. Right. Crazy, isn't it? Right. Oh, yes. Individualize the problem. That's like classic tobacco industry playbook right there. So just thinking about how we can think about emotions more maybe on a collective level, but certainly on our own level, about how the emotions that we want to, the emotions that we feel engage us for our life, for the long haul work of climate work, are probably not going to be things that make us feel bad, right? Adrienne Ray Brown, and I have a beautiful quote at the end of this, will say that we have to make justice the most pleasurable activity possible, because pleasure is the thing that's going to make people come back for more, because our brains are pleasure-seeking machines in general. I'm talking sweeping statements here. Okay, so the third reason is that the suppression of uncomfortable emotions like grief and anger, which I'm saying as uncomfortable emotions because I'm in a Western context, and in my context, those are considered uncomfortable emotions. I would say in different cultural contexts that varies. So I don't want to be misunderstood to be making kind of ontological statements about everybody feels bad about anger or grief. Often just fuels the problem even more, right? So it should go back to that circle, that wheel and the kid with his iPod, right? Like when we feel really uncomfortable, we tend to want to just get away from the uncomfortable feeling. And I don't know about you, but when I'm doom scrolling and I'm looking at all how terrible things are on my social media, because that's where I get a lot of my news, just like everybody else, right? Then Amazon comes up and helps me feel better, right? Or there's that really great fast fashion thing I can participate in if I want. Or I can start to look for new couches or whatever it is, right? And so just as one example, there are many ways that capitalism can swoop in and help us alleviate the discomfort, right? And so oftentimes the ways that we try to avoid these feelings often create worse problems, not just for our own mental health, but certainly for the planet, right? So the thing we care about that's causing us this distress might make us, if we don't have emotional intelligence to interrupt it, do things that would actually harm the planet even more. So this sort of pointing out that it frays our relationships. We often hear about this in terms of loneliness, the loneliness epidemic. We hear about this in terms of mental health. We hear about this in terms of social atrophy, the loss of social relationships, people kind of more and more isolating as a result of their feeling uncomfortable about how bad things are in the world. Anybody in the room guilty of doing that? The world's going to hell. I'm going to go watch Netflix in my room alone, right? Right. This it's really hard to lean into relationships and relationship building when you're feeling so awful about humanity, right? Which is oftentimes the way my students frame it. They just hate people, right? What people are doing to the earth. And so there's oftentimes a framing of this in terms of mental health, but I want to really point out that it does actually harm the planet too often. The fourth reason is that paying attention to emotions and the body is oftentimes considered a kind of a justice intervention on the climate sphere, right? So even within climate advocacy, you have people who are like, let's just do this all through rational problem solving. We know how to do this. Let's just pull the levers and do this. And then we have folks who are really in the more advocacy or justice spaces who are like, we got to feel our way through this, right? The feelings of bringing your heart and your mind and your body, all of it into the movement is really important. And these are the folks who have been doing social movements usually for a lot longer than the climate movement, right? So I'm thinking about land back movement, or thinking about Black Lives Matter, or even go back further, civil rights. Folks who have been doing advocacy and activism for a really long time know a lot more about how the heart and the body shape their activism and not just how it can just be a head thing, right? So bringing the body and emotions into thinking about climate work is really important for that reason too. And this is the one that got me thinking about my students in the first place. My students' well-being was affecting their ability to not just show up and take care of their own lives, but it certainly wasn't going to help them take care of the planetary issues that were going on, right? So this idea that your mental health affects your ability to engage in these things, and vice versa, right? That this is really like a cycle that I'm going to pull out in a couple more slides here in the future. But this concept of hurt people is really important, but hurt people also hurt the planet, right? That's a kind of a social work phrase, that hurt people won't be able to do this kind of work. So the healing work that we can do for ourselves has this kind of ramifications for not just our relationships with others, but certainly with the planet as well. So to kind of draw a fine point to it, like draw a line under this point, Paul Hawkins has this great quote that I really love to use to sort of capture those previous points, right? Like, what are we talking about here? We're talking about the human heart and mind is a radical climate technology, right? It's not just solar panels and cool things like that, which we do need too. I'm not saying I don't want all that stuff going on, but I love that Paul Hawkins says the heart and mind is actually the most radical one. What if we invested in the human heart and mind as much as we invest in other kinds of climate technologies, right? The kind of techno-optimism that we often hear about climate change, which is cool, right? We all have all the technology. We have everything we need to fix the problems. We just don't have the hearts and minds in place to do so, right? So that is really a leverage point that I think is underappreciated. Okay, so this is my second claim. Our nervous systems will respond to the story we choose to live in. And this kind of goes into one of the chapters in my book that I want to point out called Hack the Story, where I really want to spend some time for a moment thinking about the story that we live in and how important it is for our nervous systems. Going back, kind of always having that little wheel in our mind about how our nervous system makes us have these beliefs that we don't actually have to take as true, right? We can those things are things we can change and think differently about. Does anybody know what this is? This piece of art, these colors? Yeah, beautiful. It's actually a piece of art trying to capture the temperature rise of the planet, average global temperatures for the last 250 years or something. I can't quite remember the exact dates on it, but it's called warming stripes. And so you'll have people like on Special Climate Awareness Day or Earth Day, like wear a tie or, put it on something, these stripes. It's not Netflix. Sometimes I'm like, oh, it's Netflix. But no, it's actually a piece of art. Okay, so what I think, one of the reasons why I like this to open this is that this particular piece of art, even without any words to it, tells a story. What's the story it tells? Put some words to it. Give it a try. Yeah.
Things are getting hotter.
Things are getting hotter. Yeah, right? Okay, things are getting hotter. And then what's happening? What's going to happen on the far right of that? What's the implicit story of where this goes? Not good. Doesn't end well. Yeah, no one wants to say it. Full apocalypse, right? No one's like, no, I don't want to go there. Give me my iPod back, right? So there's this sort of, implicit doom just already in the statement. We're on the train. The train is not going to stop. This is just fact. This is a global temperature. And it's bad, and it's going off this other direction. And I'm not here to tell you that's not true. Don't think I'm about to be like, climate science denier coming out here. But I want to point out that this is a particular narrative structure and not just truth also, okay? So one of the things that I think is really interesting too is that sort of like how much hope one has about how much we can affect the future really increases the more I say, okay, we're here, right? Like if I told you we were right here in time, you'd be like, forget it, I'm not gonna do anything, right? If I told you that we were here in time, you'd be like, okay, we gotta get to work. We could change the future, right? Depending on where you are, you have a certain level of agency implied in that story, right? So where we are in the story, are we coming back from are we falling off the cliff of a golden age, right? Where things were so much better in the past and now it's terrible? Or is it a story of progress, right? That's a decline story. There's a progress story too. That used to be really bad and we're doing great now. You probably hear these competing narratives in things like Steven Pinker's book or this book called Factfulness is really great too. There's all kinds of people who are saying, actually, we should stop being so doom and gloom. Things are so much better than they used to be. This kind of progress story. right? Or you have the very much like the kind of trope of America, make America great again, which is like this very much a decline story, right? So these different stories have architect to it that I want to point out. Joanna Macy, beautiful eco-Buddhist activist who died last year. Actually, she was in her 90s. Often talked about the stories we live in as being so important in her work called The Work That Reconnects. Her word for the story of the kind of going off the edge of the cliff, doom and gloom one is something called the Great Unraveling. And this will feel like maybe the story that you live in every day, which, you know, this is the news headlines, of course. What she's trying to point out, though, is that there's something in our brains called the negativity, or there's cognitive biases that really, you know, we have a lot of cognitive biases. If you want to look at a really great book about this, there's several books out there, but I would recommend Anne-Christine Duhaim's book called Minding the Climate. She's a neuroscientist who's written about the cognitive biases and how they shape our environmental capacities. One of them is a negativity bias, which basically is sort of like Rick Hansen, the neuroscientist, says, sort of sums it up this way, that our brains are like Teflon for good things and Velcro for bad. And anybody who's like gotten course evaluations will know what I'm talking about. I've got one student who hated everything. I can only think about them and change everything around their critiques, you know? Whereas like 99% were like, you did great. And I'm like, I forget it. I got to change it. So, right, this like, I'm only going to look at the bad, right? It's evolutionary in there, right? We want to make sure we find the saber-toothed tiger in the sunflowers. We're not going to sit there and go, oh, the sunflowers are so beautiful, right? If there's like a threat lurking in that, right? So it's evolutionary. That's cool. Thank you to the brain for having that evolutionary ability to see the threats so that we can survive. Great. But of course, the problem is that it's like overbalanced on bad, right? And this is the sort of negativity bias in our brains that is the demand that creates the supply. With the increasing corporatization of media only wants to produce stuff that gets eyeballs, right? That gets attention. And the attention is coming from people who, without awareness of their negativity bias, love the algorithms that just juice up the negativity, right? So the Great Unraveling, we are living in a story of a warming planet, absolutely, right? There's no doubt about that. The science is in on that, and that's reality. But, however, also our brains and the media that serves up our brains what they want is telling us also that it's really, really, really bad. And we're not seeing anything else, right? And this has kind of a negative, this kind of actually has a feedback loop effect, right? This is what I call the doom loop, right? This is like my brain sees the bad, so the news produces the bad. Here's a really good example of the corporatization of media juicing our brains with our bad negativity bias, saying, oh, you have a negativity bias, and you're also going to give me money with your attention. I know how to make that work, right? Thank you, capitalism, right? There's a negativity bias. This is a graph that shows that these different emotions over the last 20 years and something like 47 popular news outlets that are listed here. And you can see a much starker increase of sadness, a much starker increase of disgust, anger, fear. And of course, this increased negativity bias in the news really is a result of the corporatization of media, which tracks on the exact same time frame, which shows how the changes of people, how they get media, how they get their news is now through social media. And this increases pressure for eyeballs, which people have called the attention economy, right? So this idea that the attention economy is now dictating how news has to be produced. Therefore, it's going to only produce great unraveling stories because that's what gets the attention and that's what sells the news, right? So there's a sort of multiple things happening at once here, conversion. I wanted to kind of unpack, because I have this background in literary and cultural analysis, and I want to unpack what's going on with the great unraveling archetype and why does it make us feel so terrible? First of all, there's kind of this trope of inevitability. There's nothing that you can do about it, right? So if you're over on the far right of this image, you're thinking, I'm going to throw my hands up. I can't do anything about it. It's inevitable. It's happening. And when I work with a colleague who does research in Africa and Nigeria specifically, it's so interesting. Of the like very small percentage of people there who even know what climate change is, the people who the explanation for it is it's God's will, right? This kind of like, I can't do anything about it, right? It's God's will. Or you can just say this, the ship has left the station. Or you can even say it's natural. I don't know if any of you had debates with people who say it's just natural cycles of the earth, right? So therefore, there's nothing we can do about it, is the point. It's inevitable. There's a decline from an era of good times, a fall from grace. And this, of course, has in its architectural structure a very biblical kind of like prelapsarian, oh, we got to get back to the garden kind of a vibe to it. This comes out in the narrative structure that's really popular in the United States, called the Jeremiah, the American Jeremiah. There's a sort of like the very common structure of getting people to change their behavior is to sort of beat them over the head about how they've sinned. It used to be so good, now they have to get better, right? It's not actually universal, that particular trope, that particular archetype, but it's very common to the environmental movement, right? We've had that going on in the environmental movement for a long time. They're unspecific actors. All of humanity is the culprit. So this is oftentimes how students are taught in classes. And this is even how NSF doles out its grants, right? Human impacts, human dimensions, right? There's no variation of which kinds of humans might be doing really bad things and which kinds of humans might be doing really good things. And maybe there are really great humans out there, right? Living where I live, where there's a huge amount of indigenous activity around climate change, there's a lot of push to say, don't just talk about humanity being bad, because that erases all of this work that we've been doing for millennia to make the environment good, despite colonialism, right? There's this pessimistic view of human nature. Oops, all humans are bad and they're selfish and they're greedy. And this is definitely something that I have to work with my own kids, right? It's sort of like, when they come to this awakening about how bad things are in the world, it's so easy to go to that low-hanging fruit of saying, well, then all humans are bad. There's so much evidence out there that they're greedy and selfish. The intended emotional effects of this archetype, of course, right? This is what I'm seeing in my students. This is what we see kind of at the collective level. Fear, anxiety, resignation, powerlessness, apathy, separation. And sometimes the apathy is the opposite. There's urgency, right? This is why you have somebody get an AK-47 out in El Paso, right? A sense of urgency. So this kind of like, the emotional effects without an intervention can lead to really bad things. And I'm thinking about, I've done a lot of research in my life and I'm still doing work on this, on the phenomenon of ecofascism, right? So there's sort of like when climate anxiety turns violent, right? How climate anxiety or big eco emotions shape social interactions. What does this do to our capacity to respond? You could probably guess, right? Those of you who are familiar with the window of tolerance will recognize this, right? Like when we're triggered out of our resilience zone, whatever you want to call it. I know that some folks in sort of more trauma-centered spaces don't like this language, right? But call it whatever you want. There's a sort of nervous system regulation space that you're in when you can do things like think about the collective common good, think about the future, think about whether or not your actions align with your values. Think about other people, have empathy. These are probably too hard to read, but things like being engaged, being receptive to feedback, mindful of your thoughts, practicing empathy. And I really like that this particular graphic, which is why I chose it, has this ability has this emphasis around when you're regulated, you can think about the long term, right? That there's a temporal dimension to your nervous system regulation as well, right? And we often hear about this. I'm too busy with my immediate fires going on around me, and I have too many traumas and difficulties in my life. I can't think about climate change, right? There we go. Just because our nervous systems as at a collective level are not very well right now. You noticed, right? No matter where you are in the political spectrum. And then we can see here, this kind of maps onto that circle from the beginning, right? That we can go hyper or hypo-aroused in our reaction when we have some sense of threat or risk in the world, right? So when we consume information about the great unraveling, depending on who you are, you might go more into hypo-arousal or more hyper-arousal, unless you've done a lot of this emotional work to stay in that resilient zone. It takes effort. The whole kind of world and capitalism and our cultural conditions of individualism are really trained to not have us stay there, right? Capitalism doesn't work very well if we're all in here, right? So it really benefits from people being kind of chronically dysregulated. I'm thinking about the beautiful book Inflamed. Probably many people in this room are familiar with Raj Patel and oh my gosh, who's the other author from the book? Inflamed, Anatomy of Deep Justice. That describes that, a beautiful book. A second thing that this does to our capacity to respond is has this effect of what social psychologists call pseudo-inefficacy. And I had to practice that word many, many times before I could say it fast. Without problems, that's a big chunky word. And this idea of pseudo-inefficacy, I love the fact that they're emphasized the pseudo part, right? That people are less likely to offer help if they think that the problem is too big for them to solve. This is because the negative feeling of not being able to solve the whole problem outweighs the positive feeling of being able to solve even a small part. So if the problem was framed as really small, like if we wake up in the day and say, all we have to do is a couple of emails, We're going to be like, cool, I'll do it right now. Let's go. It's small. If I woke up today and said, I have to write a whole book today, I'd be like, never mind. I'm going to go find my iPod, right? Right. I'm going to go do my little dissociation thing. That's too much, right? So the scale of the problem, or how we perceive the problem to be big, very much affects our sense of agency of whether we can solve it. And it turns out that a sense of agency really is the holy grail, right? So when I go back to those students that I'm thinking about in my class, what is that like emotion that they need to do something for their whole life? Hope, yeah, somebody mentioned hope, but it turns out actually a sense of agency is the most important one. A sense of efficacy, at least in kind of a Western context, where we have kind of like an individualistic universe where a sense of personal efficacy, as they call it, is extremely important for mental health, more so than happiness, more so than even, hope, really. It's crazy to think. So this is all this whole situation about our nervous systems responding to the great unraveling conspires to make us not be able to do the work. Right? This is kind of my final big claim. How does this happen? Okay, let's just kind of deconstruct this, go over the lay of the land that I just described. The negativity bias and that feedback loop I talked about earlier leads us to this perception that we're living in the great unraveling, which leads us to these feelings of pseudo-inefficacy and dysregulation, which leads us oftentimes to actions that further harm and isolate. And when we're isolated and by ourselves and all these feelings, we often don't go and do the kind of collective efficacy work that needs to happen for the planet, right? And it creates this feedback loop I'm trying to draw out for you. All right, so how do we disrupt this, right? How do we disrupt this doom loop? What we're really trying to do is figure out, somebody already mentioned it, right? How do we transform our distress into this engagement? We want to be down here, right? Information coming in is still really bad. We can definitely regulate and think about how we're getting our information, right? Thich Nhat Hanh often talks about being very mindful of the nutriments we consume every day, right? Like everything we consume every day, every piece of information, every way we put our attention, every time we spend our time on or money on something, we're manifesting and bringing into life the world that we're practicing. Right. And so to be very, very thoughtful about that world that we're practicing. Right. So we can do this. We can move our focus into thinking about social engagement and not just be stuck in one of these other ones that oftentimes can have deleterious effects on ourselves, each other, and certainly the planet. Right. Okay. So this is where I'm coming to towards the end of my talk. I want to offer 5 tools of collective resilience that would help us heal from and hopefully avoid burnout. To be resourced to face the polycrisis and reduce its harms. Okay, so these are the tools that in the research that I have come up with in the book, and would like to share. Some of you probably doing some of this already and thinking about some of this. One is paying attention to our attention. I really love this beautiful quote by the Indian novelist Arundhati Roy, who says, "Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing." This idea that the stories that we're paying attention to are either going to be those stories of like the warming stripes, we're going off the deep end and we're in that inevitability trope, or we're in a story where all kinds of other things are possible, right? So you have on like the eve of this 2016 presidential election, Valerie Carr, a poet, writing or saying at a speech that maybe the darkness that we're in is the darkness of the womb, not the darkness of the tomb. This kind of reframe of thinking about transformation, not apocalypse, right? The future is not set yet. We don't know what's going to happen. And in fact, that is true, scientifically true. We don't know. So we want to stave off the actual apocalypse and those feelings of isolation that being in the great unraveling might want to cause us to feel by paying much more attention to stories of solutions and collective power. They're just not going to be in the news the same way, right? The juicing algorithms and those media, corporatization of media doesn't want to put those stories in front of our faces. We have to actively seek them out. Much of what I'm offering here requires going against the grain of what mainstream society wants to flow you through, right? It kind of requires a little bit of a wake up. Our brains really like it when we know we're not alone. If we think everybody around us is what Paul Hawken calls the blessed unrest, all doing this amazing work, look at all the people who care. You know, Mr. Rogers' mom saying, look for the helpers, right? This kind of awareness of all this mycelium network of people doing all this stuff. You will be in a very different atmosphere, emotional atmosphere, right? Our brains really like that. If we think everybody around us is evil and greedy and awful, and we get that misanthropic thing going on where we hate humanity, it's very, very unlikely that we're going to be getting up every morning and being like, okay, let's get to work. This is great. Let's go. Right? That pleasure-seeking part of our brain, two things it likes: connection and feeling good, right? Connection is a real critical part of feeling good. Karen and I were just talking about how COVID still has this ramifications on campuses of people kind of coming out and connecting, right? There's an excuse to not connect. It's really easy. The easy thing is to not connect. Our brains like it when our efforts are celebrated in community, and our brains like it when we feel we're of service. So it's interesting. We often think that humans are motivated mostly by individualism or greed, but it turns out humans are much more motivated by the feeling of being of service. Am I of use in my lifetime? Right? What good am I? Do I matter? Brains really like to feel like we matter. Joanna Macy offers an alternative to the Great Unraveling called the Great Turning. And I would say that the Great Turning archetype is quite the opposite of the Great Unraveling. In the Great Turning, the future is still ours to make. Better worlds are possible. A movement of helpers exists. There's not one single hero, which of course is the model in most American culture. Awareness of the collective reduces individualism and alienation. Specific people are to blame. We can tackle this, right? It's not all of humanity. That feels really impossible to deal with. I can't change all the people on the planet, so I'm going to just give up, right? No, in fact, there are very specific people. There's just as much evidence that humans can do good in the world as bad. Examples of the Great Turning don't make the news. They're often slow and invisible. Rebecca Solnit writes about this beautifully. She talks about that work being in the shadows. We might want to reframe this whole story narrative arc and think about being in the womb, not the tomb. What's possible? The intended emotional effects of living in the Great Turning are, of course, hope, efficacy, empowerment, solidarity, pleasure, and joy. And I'm not saying that either one of these stories is more true than the other, right? I am suggesting that they're both true, they're both equally true, and that the whole way that the system is working would rather us live in the Great Unraveling because that disempowers us, right? The system would rather us be in that space because we give up. Just let the machinations of extraction continue. A second tool, this is the title of one of my chapters, Be Less Right and More in Relation. This is a mantra for me because I often am teaching classes where my students don't feel like they can speak until they know they're right. It's so interesting. Oh, I don't feel comfortable speaking until I'm really sure I'm right. The righteousness need, the will to righteousness and domination with your will to power and reason is so deep in us, right? Like I'm like shouldn't even be here unless I'm right. Right? This sort of like, let's just arm our students, as I used to think my job was, arm my students with a lot of arguments so they're more right. This liberates us from powerlessness and despair and repairs the root of the problem. Here's the one from Adrienne Muir Brown I was talking about earlier. Working with our brains, working with our biases and cognitive shortcuts, being aware of them, what our brains are wired for, and also becoming more cognizant of how the negativity bias, the availability bias, the status quo bias, all these biases that I have not defined for you, but they're out there, right? You can look it up, are actually working against us, and we can kind of shortcut them, right? So becoming aware of how the brain wants to deal with this stuff is really cool. Audre Lorde's beautiful quote, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it's self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. This goes to the argument I was making earlier about how our well-being affects our capacity to do this work, right? And this is how we're showing up. It matters. And our nervous systems shape these relationships, right? I said this before. And the final one, this is the one that I hold on to when I am the lowest of the low, which is feed what I want to grow. Love is actually a replenishing emotion and a political strategy. I'm not talking about the kind of love where you just say, oh, I forgive my neighbor or I forgive my enemy or turn the other cheek. I'm not talking about that kind of love of whatever. I'm talking about using love, the stuff that you are grieving about, the stuff that you fear and you have anxiety about, as kind of a signal to help you figure out what you love, because those are the things that are threatening something that you love. And there are two ways that you can get rid of the monster under the bed. You can either attack the monster under the bed, or you can make the stuff that you love, that the monster is threatening, get bigger, right? Reduce the one or increase the other. And my argument here is that the emotion of love that helps nurture and gets that feedback loop going of nurturing that which you love is a much more sustainable emotion. And so this is what I want to end on. How might you integrate these tools in your own life? Enlist the most radical climate technology available to us, our hearts and minds, and disrupt this doom loop. How might you choose to live in the great turning, where the future is yet to be determined? How might you unlearn individualism and build social connection? How might you work with your brain's default reward-seeking wiring and actively rewire cognitive biases that don't help? How might you take responsibility for your nervous system so you aren't hurting others in the planet? And how might you feed what you want to grow, divesting your attention from the attention economy and the great unraveling and pouring it into the things that you love? And that is what I'll leave us on and have some time, 10 minutes or so, for folks who can stick around and ask questions. I'd love to have a chat and learn from you and hear what you're thinking about and how you're doing this already in your work. Thank you. Thoughts or questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Want to grab the mic first?
Oh, Mike.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Angie.
Hi, thank you so much for all of that. My name is Lucy and I teach in the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural
Great.
Resources, and we teach your
Yay.
book in my and Amy's class, Intro to
Awesome.
Environmental Studies. And
Yay.
yeah, just appreciate this, so inspiring and reminder, you know, that we teach a lot of solution and living in hope and joy, but it's to hear it from you and be like a pseudo student right now is so nice, and like not to have to lead the charge, but just to listen. And so thank you for all that hope and reminder. I'm curious how you understand the feeling recipe or ingredients of sense of urgency. So what are the actual feelings maybe that go into that sense of being? You framed it as a feeling, and I'm just curious to hear more about what that means.
Does anybody in the room know what urgency feels like? Want to share, like, just so we put some like description around the feeling of urgency? Because you're right, that's not really one of the things that like therapists would call a feeling. Agitation, beautiful. Yeah. So it's like a sense of fear, real fear. These are good emotions. Yeah. Anything else for urgency? Anxiety, impatience, maybe, right? Restlessness. Yeah. And I think one of the reasons why I pull it out as a urgency as kind of an emotion is because there's so much urgency in the climate movement, right? This kind of like the IPCC came out, the 2018 IPCC report was that sort of like, you know, climate clock, right? That this is going to be done in within 15 years, our chances are going to be gone, right? So like drew a line in the sand that this was going to not be worth even trying to fix anymore at a certain point. Or you have people who are like, we got to do it now, right? Greta Thunberg talking about, I want you to feel fear about climate change as if your house was on fire, right? That's sort of like desire for her to help folks who aren't perceiving the risk of climate change to have it be framed as something as more fearful as like your house on fire. So she was right there engaging in risk perception theory, right? Like there are certain conditions that a threat needs to have for people to perceive it as a risk because of the way we're evolutionary designed, right? So like there has to be like a face to the culprit, right? It's very hard to get worked up about climate change because there's no real face to it. Right. Or for example, there has to be like volition and intention to hurt me. Like if I came up to you and accidentally tripped over your foot right now, you'd be like, oh, you know, it's okay. But if you could tell that my volition was that I actively wanted to hurt you, you feel a little bit more threatened. Right. So there's an intention or volition of the person doing this to you or the animal or whatever that causes increase of risk perception. Climate change doesn't meet any of these conditions. Right. And so that's why Greta Thunberg was like, your house on fire. So this desire to frame climate change as urgency has been very much part of what the climate movement has been trying to do. And for good reason. And I'm not against that argument that it's not urgent. I do agree with that. But all kinds of folks, for example, Kyle Powis-White, who's a Potawatomi climate philosopher, talks about urgency being actually a way that the colonizer just gets more power, right? Like in a state of urgency, you can kind of take away more power from people. You can actually, get rid of democratic processes. You can sort of say, well, the minority voices in the room, we're just not going to hear them because we don't have the time for that, right? So it sort of creates this perception of time scarcity around getting the problem solved. And I'm sort of wanting to pull that out as like, if we feel this if we allow ourselves to get that kind of amygdala hijack of urgency, we oftentimes get dysregulated and outside of our window of tolerance where we can make wise decisions. If you feel like you're actually having a fire in front of you, you're not likely to have your executive functioning locked in really well, right? You're more likely to be in fight, flight, or freeze mode. Does that make sense? Yeah. And so it's kind of like, bye, Amy. Yeah. That sort of emotional awareness of how fear and anxiety and urgency, the narrative of urgency, might tip you over into not doing wise actions. Yeah. Thank you for that great question, Lucy.
Hi, Dr. Ray. This is Whitney Calkins. I'm online today. Normally, I'm in the auditorium moderating grand rounds, and I'm just looking at our chat, and I see a
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. It's been so good, and I wrote down so many of your quotes for daily reminders for myself. But there's a question here from Eileen Kelly saying she's working with medical students who are just trying to keep up with their medical education and feeling really guilty for not participating in social and climate issues. And she wondered if you might have advice for these students who are, they really want to participate, but they're so overwhelmed with just getting through school.
That's I think that's not just medical students, right?
Yeah,
that's a lot of students. Yeah, so thank you for that. And yeah, I think, and it's not just medical students, not just students, right? There's a real sense of the problem is too big and the things that are in my immediate life are too all consuming. I'm already overwhelmed and burned out, right? So there's a sense of there's a real privilege to time and space in your life to be able to care about the climate. And that is part of one of the places where I think the climate movement has really failed people to think that their activism or the work that they could do around climate isn't something they could do in their daily life, even when it's really, really busy. This is a real failure of the climate movement. And so the way that I would correct that, or that I'm offering to correct that, is to think of becoming a doctor or think of becoming a whatever you're becoming. A lot of times my students come into environmental studies, which is a BA. Even they don't feel like they're doing enough because they don't have a BS. Right? There's a sort of all kinds of assumptions built into what counts as a good climate action or a good action. And I think we really want to push back on that and think really, really, really broadly about what kinds of actions are good climate actions. And even to go to the point of thinking about, and this is getting kind of Zen and koan kind of on you, but inaction as action too, right? Every time we're not doing actions, we're doing actions, right? And that can be a good thing or a bad thing. It depends on, what the intention behind it is. With my students, I often tell them that their job is to figure out their perfect climate magic. And Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson does a beautiful job of this. She's one of the editors of All We Can Save, and also a beautiful book that just came out called What If We Get It Right? And she does a beautiful TED Talk, and I recommend anybody who's faculty working medical students or anybody's faculty in general, show her 10-minute TED Talk, maybe it's 13 minutes, because she walks people through basically saying, you don't have to change what you're doing. You don't have to be anybody different. You actually just need to do the work of figuring out what your particular unique, beautiful set of skills is and marry that in sort of a Venn diagram way with what the world needs, right? So she has this Venn diagram of 3 circles. One is what brings you joy, what the world needs, and what your unique skills and passions. And so that real honesty of saying, I'm not going to force myself to become something that I'm not by going down a path where I think that's what's needed, but to marry what's needed with what you love and what gives you joy and what you're good at. And I think if students in either medical students, but really all of them, right? All of us, right? Don't have to become something that we are not to do good climate work. And I know it's going to come across as crazy, but I often feel this way. I often think the stuff I'm doing around emotions or the stuff I'm doing around, how can we feel differently about climate change is really not where the action is. We need much more urgent something else. So I'm in that, that sense of self-doubt too, a lot of time. And I think we all would do a lot better if we had a real sense of, hey, I'm locked into my part. I'm not going to do it all myself. There's a wide range of what counts as a good climate action that I need to get more creative about. And to find comfort in knowing that if you're doing something you're passionate about that's of service to the world, that you're doing enough, doing more than enough, right? So yeah, there's kind of an overly limited definition of what counts as climate work that I would push really hard against there. And also recognize that many of my students come out of the BA and don't even go into environmental work because they realize, oh, actually what they care about is queer mental health, or actually what they care about is housing. And that those things touch climate change. Those things touch climate change. Health touches climate change, right? So yeah, in a polycrisis, anything that is of service where we're reducing harms anywhere, and even if that's just in ourselves, that's beautiful work. So I love the question. Yeah, I have strong feelings about that question. I recommend Elizabeth Johnson's TED Talk. Yeah.
How would you speak to someone who is really deep in the, like, someone who doesn't think they need to act?
Yeah.
Just because, like, they're in denial sort of about anything that's happening, and they're in like flight. So how would you kind of start a conversation about the climate?
That's a really good question. My first answer to that is to answer you on the surface of your question, but then I also want to push back on the question too, which is Catherine Hayhoe, who is a climate communicator, has beautiful TED Talks about this. And there's Yale Center for Climate Change has like 6 steps you can take. So there's like really cool resources out there for talking to somebody who doesn't agree with you on climate change. And I recommend you go to those resources. They basically say, listen first, find common ground of shared concerns, and then bring in climate if you even can, not even necessarily using that word to talk about how the things that you mutually love are threatened by climate change. So there's sort of strategies for that. But I would also say, to the sort of earlier point about the swath of Americans who care, folks who are in denial or not interested in talking about it are actually a very, very small percentage. And there's this concept called pluralistic ignorance that social psychologists have researched. And the Yale Center for Climate Change has a great article on this on their website too, which is basically that most of us go around thinking, because we're living in the great unraveling, because our attention is looking at the negative, right? We assume that most people around us don't care about the things we care about. Let's say climate change for now, right? We go around saying, if I surveyed everyone in this room and said to you, how much percentage of the people in this room do you think care about climate change? Well, maybe not this room, but everybody here probably does, right? You're making assumptions, but like we on average think that something like 40% maybe, where in fact 70-75% do. And that has real material consequences for our behavior. If we go around the world thinking that only 40% or 20% care as much as we care, we're less likely to talk to people, we're less likely to bring it up, we're less likely to do actions in our lives, right? So there's all kinds of ways that thwarts our climate action, to just the assumption that people don't care as much as we care. So this goes back to the living in the great unraveling, right? And like why it's so important to live in the great turning, where we assume and know that 75% of people around us are doing something, they care, right? And that just living in a world where you realize, oh, I'm going to assume that 75% everywhere I go are doing something. And if nothing else, they at least are bought in, right? They might not know what to do, but they are looking for some direction. They would do something if they had something they could do. Right. So I think starting with the premise that you're not going up against hostile territory every time you're talking to somebody is really important, right? Because deniers are 7% of Americans. 7% of Americans deny climate change. It just so happens they have a really big megaphone in power right now, right? And I would even argue, and this is a much more complicated thing, but I would even argue that the people in power right now are very, very, very motivated by climate anxiety. Those folks are profoundly climate literate, right? They're not talking about climate change, right? Because they don't want to deal with it. They'd much rather blame immigrants for what's happening, right? But there is a real shared awareness of climate change happening. It's just that denial is not even the right word, right? It's suppression. So there are strategies. If you know someone in your life and you want to have a strategy, they're available to you. They're really good. Catherine Hayhoe does a beautiful TED Talk. And like I said, Yale Center for Climate Change has like all kinds of recommendations for how to talk to people. But I think it's interesting how when I give this talk, how many people ask me, how can I talk to somebody who disagrees? And I just assume it's like you have an Uncle Bob that you have to go talk to in your life. And so you're thinking about Uncle Bob or whatever it is, right? And that's really important. You want to talk to Uncle Bob. Every single person you talk to helps. But it's incredible how much the assumption that most people around us don't agree about climate change stops us from doing stuff. And so I also, at the same time as saying, here are some strategies to talk to Uncle Bob, want you to recognize the power of pluralistic ignorance on how it affects how you get up and move through the world in your day. Thinking that you're around a world of heroes and helpers changes how you move through the day. And whether or not you think you're in a great turning and you're actually bringing about a world you desire rather than just being handed a world that you would fear, which I think doesn't make anyone want to get up in the morning, you know, especially young people. Yeah, I don't know if that helps, but thank you for that question. Yeah. Oh, okay. Oh, we're 5 minutes after. Thank you, everybody, so much.
Totally go up.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Hang around. Thanks for your time. I appreciate you hanging in there. Thank you.